Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Welcome, Jim. We're sans Austin today, but thought we'd talk a little bit about what's happening with some of our naval exploits, not so good exploits. These are in our shipyards. It seems the Navy has forgotten how to build ships well. What's happening?
Well, they've they've lost track of building some kinds of new ships. I mean, there's good news and bad news. The good news, they've still been able to build nuclear submarines effectively, and that is because there's a different culture in the Navy when it comes to nuclear subs. Partially the result of the two that were lost in the 60s because of poor quality control. So the Navy has maintained, that's one tradition that survived. They've maintained their the mania, as it were, for quality control. I'll get into that later. A bigger problem with the failures has to do with the fact that the Navy has never recaptured the magic it had, how should I put it, during World War II and for a couple of decades after that, where they could effectively design new warships and get them made. Of course, they became more and more expensive, but that was a trend that was going on with all sorts of military weaponry. In fact, there was one defense a guy named Augustine, who was actually the president of one of the major defense manufacturers, and he wrote scathingly on this trend, as it were, and he had what he called Augustine's Law. But anyway, it was very prophetic. I mean, this was back in the 70s, I think. He said, at the rate things are going, eventually we'll only be able to build one aircraft. Now, that was prophetic in so far as we had to build a lot fewer B-2 stealth bombers and F-22 stealth fighters because they were simply too expensive. I mean, even Congress has its limits. They regard defense spending, especially procurement, as a prime source of pork, for getting jobs in their districts and getting reelected. That causes problems, but that's been going on forever, long before the United States was even around. I mean, some of the oldest historical records we've recovered, the hieroglyphic, things in clay from Babylonia and whatnot, complained about that. Ancient Chinese records, record the same problems. But with the Navy, they have a problem where they are literally able to build fewer and fewer ships because they keep coming up with ideas that are too expensive. They find this out too late, and simply can't be implemented. So the Navy intrinsically has a problem in designing new types of ships. We saw that with the Seawolf. That was a nuclear submarine. There were debates in the Navy about, whether we really needed this. It was a very ambitious design, but it was designed at the end of the Cold War. Nobody expected the Soviet Union to go poof in 1991 and eliminate the major naval threat to the United States and NATO. But then again, nobody foresaw the growth of the Chinese fleet. There was never a Chinese fleet before, but they never needed one. But now they're dependent upon imports of raw materials and exports of all sorts of manufactured goods to keep their economy going. So the fearsome Russian fleet of the Cold War era has now been replaced by an even more dangerous Chinese fleet. And of course, as we have demonstrated or explained in Strategy Page regularly, the Chinese are building warships on a wartime basis. In other words, they're not going headlong into developing new technology. They're basically plundering a lot from us. You see that in the news where a lot of their new warships seem strikingly like, existing American models. And they do get a lot of stolen technology. But basically, they have one of the largest commercial shipbuilding industries in the world. They compete with Japan and South Korea, and they basically have plenty of skilled workers to apply to building warships. I think I put that out today. A piece on their aircraft carrier assembly line. They're literally building. They have built and are in the process of finishing it. A new shipyard for carriers, which can basically turn them out at a rate we haven't seen since the World War II, when we were turning out those Essex-class carriers at such a rapid clip. Well, they're doing it with conventional and eventually nuclear carriers. They haven't gotten to the submarine bit yet, but they are developing missiles like their ballistic missiles that can hit a carrier at sea, and other types of missiles. So they are definitely a more dangerous, more lethal threat than the Russians ever were. Meanwhile, the Navy keeps stumbling around in the dark, especially when it comes to surface warships. We saw the disaster with the Zumwalt, the DDG 1000, which we can only afford 3 of. We were supposed to have 32 of them. And the LCS, the Littoral Combat, ship. What we are doing now is what we should have done long ago. Is as far as the smaller size surface combatants, the frigates and corvettes, simply adapt European designs, which have been very successful. For example, the last two classes of Coast Guard high sea ships, cutters, were basically used European designs. One time, they only used the European design because an American design simply didn't work. I mean, it was flawed. And they had to basically drop the whole thing, and they realized that, hey, the Dutch have a ship we could adapt, and boom. Our largest cutters are basically a copy of a British class of high seas, offshore patrol vessel for their Coast Guard, and that's proven very successful. But for the destroyers and cruisers, which we're the only ones really building them, and our destroyers are really just somewhat larger, destroyers with more weapons and what have you. We had to drop the Zumwalt because we simply couldn't build them. We couldn't make them work anyway. They had a lot of new tech, which was great on paper, but never was made to work in practice. We're only producing 3 of those. Sounds familiar, just shades of the Seawolf. And we're going back to building more of the Burkes, which are the last and probably best destroyer class we ever built, based upon incremental improvements from successful World War II designs. We had several classes of destroyers in World War II, and after World War II, we picked the best features of each of them and developed the Spruance class, and then followed by the Burkes. And we probably will keep building them for over a decade because the Navy still says, well, we'll come up with something better, but they have to change their culture of developing new designs and implementing them before they attempt it. And I think the Navy is chastened about that. I mean, they've been basically beat up by their own flaws for so long that there is a sense of, we may be doing things wrong. Our approach may be flawed, and if they want to see, how a successful design philosophy works, they should look no further than the nuclear subs, the ballistic missile subs, and the attack subs, the SSNs, and that's where we have been a success. But even that is running into problems, which are not really the fault of the Navy. It's a problem that the Russians also had after the Cold War ended. They basically stopped buying new ships. Boom, just like that. There were some designs which were basically mothballed, half completed, because there simply wasn't money to do it. Well, what the Russians ran into, and they're still suffering from, is they basically let go all their skilled workers, and they had a lot of them. These guys found work elsewhere, or they simply got old and they retired. And now they find there's a shortage of skilled manpower, which has been hurting them because they've had quality control problems worse than ours. And their problem is their population is shrinking, especially the Slavic population, which is the best educated, where most of the skilled shipyard workers came from. The American problem is somewhat different. We have we always had a low, unemployment rate, and it's even lower now. And the skilled workers from the Cold War era and the ones recruited in the 1990s when we were still building ships, not as much as before, but we still had a fairly vigorous warship construction program. But a lot of those workers, hired in the 1990s, they're coming up for retirement. So we have, we basically encouraged a lot of the Cold War vets to hang on. But I mean, these guys can only go for so long before they want to collect those nice pensions and go off to Florida or wherever. So at the same time, we're losing a lot of, retiring workers. The Navy is building even more submarines. It's not just the Virginias, which they've been knocking out at the rate of about 2 a year, to replace the aging Los Angeles class, which are retiring at a rapid rate. And they need about 66 of them. That's how many they plan on buying. But they keep, as they should, improving each batch. The batches come in groups of 4 or 8, submarines. They find things that can be improved. New technology, as we know in the computer business, electronics, goes obsolete a lot faster than warships do. And if you want to stay competitive, especially with the Chinese breathing down your neck, you have to keep implementing these known improvements and upgrades. And that has led to some substantial changes. For example, the next batch, the Virginia 5, as it were, batch 5, implements a radical change in the design, whereas they're adding more launch tubes for cruise missiles. Now, this has proven very successful. We've used these Virginia-class boats in Syria, where they can fire a lot of cruise missiles on short notice, and these things are accurate. They hit the target, and the submarine goes away. So we said, well, less, more is better. So now they're going to have 40. Then batch 5 is going to have 40 of these launch tubes. Now, this raised a stink in the Navy, which is still probably not going to be unresolved, because we know that if we're going to use them again in wartime, it's going to be against the Chinese. And of course, the Chinese realize that. They take note of our experience with our nuclear subs. And, if you launch a bunch of these cruise missiles, even while the sub is submerged, it comes up the periscope deck, they're, close to the surface, and launches it. That discloses the location of your nuclear sub. Now, if the Chinese keep improving their anti-submarine detection technology, which they're doing, and they're especially doing it in the South China Sea, where they're installing a underwater arrays of passive sensors, which just listen for submarines. This is like the SOSA system we had in the North Atlantic and in the Pacific during the Cold War. This basically makes our submarines even more vulnerable. And, of course, what the submarine captains are complaining about, they said, look, if we have to go in there close in to launch these cruise missiles, even though they have a range of a couple of 1,000 kilometers, the Chinese are going to detect that, and that sub's going to be basically in danger, and it's going to spend at least a few days evading the Chinese anti-submarine forces, the airborne ones, and the Chinese are building more aircraft, maritime patrol aircraft like our like the new Poseidon. That's going to basically take these guys out of action, as it were, effective action, for at least a week. But that's neither here nor there, because in the meantime, that additional cruise missile launch capability is a big plus for the submarines. It means they have more things they can do in times of not so much war, but a lot of crises going on around the world. We still have North Korea and Iran to worry about. But these subs are 30% larger than the previous Virginias, and that means even more work, more workers, just at a time when there are fewer workers. So now the Navy is basically bringing its hands out. We have a piece coming up in the next week or two on that. but they have to decide, what are they going to do? Because the one of the two shipyards that builds nuclear subs, the one in New England, they're having particular problems with recruiting skilled workers. It's less of a problem with the other yard down in Virginia, and there's no magic solution for that. So that's going to be you'll see that in the news, by and by, as it becomes more of a crisis, as it were. But the Navy's basic problem is they still haven't demonstrated that they can effectively design and build on time and on budget new surface warships.
Now, they've had some real problems with their carriers, right, Jim?
That's another problem. Yes, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have overlooked that. Yeah, they got themselves, they stepped on their own tail, as it were, with the Ford class. Somebody, we've covered this regularly in Strategy Page. What it comes down to is they have several innovative changes in the Fords. One, they use the new nuclear fueling system, which doesn't require the warship to go in at least once during its lifetime and be out of action for 4 or 5 years, to be partially taken apart so the nuclear reactors can be refueled. The new design basically allows a carrier to be built with a nuclear power plant that'll last 40 years. So that is a big efficiency. But then they had this other great idea, which sounded great on paper, they all do, about the electromagnetic catapults, which again, on paper, were more efficient. They used electricity instead of steam, and everybody thought this was a great idea. The problem was, and this is the Navy's fault, they didn't test it enough before they started installing it in a new carrier. And so now they have the Ford, which has a major problem in that the reliability of the emails, as they call it, the electromagnetic launch system, is much less effective than the old steam catapult system. There was another problem, which is again a management classic screw up, where they have a new system of hoist elevators for bringing weapons up to the deck so they can basically get them on the aircraft. Well, they screwed up in designing those, and I mean this was just straight out incompetence. And so the Ford not only can't launch aircraft as rapidly as the old carriers, but they can't even get the weapons up. Now that is not as huge a problem as you might think, because more and more of these aircraft are using, they're all using only smart bombs, as it were. So you need to have far fewer bombs. But only, I think, 2 or 3 of the 11 elevators is operating on the Ford, the first ship. So that's one very flawed, carrier. And a bunch of Fords are supposed to replace the retiring Nimitzes. So that's a major problem, which is still being, wrestled with. But again, the problem really goes back to the Navy. In the submarine service, because they lost the Scorpion and the Thresher in the 60s because of poor quality control, and because the Navy, the submariners, are pretty insistent. They operate, under very adverse conditions, deep water. A minor problem like a leak can be fatal for a submarine. In a big ship where this stuff happens, you can fix it, you can tolerate it for a while. It cannot be tolerated in a submarine. In other words, there's less tolerance for any problems with a nuclear submarine. So the nuclear submarine community and the officers in charge of that are all submarine officers for the most part. So they basically have a dog in the fight, as it were. It's their own hides. They maybe have, some of their children. You have women on the cruise now, and so they have something invested in this. And they're basically trying to they're seriously making serious and successful efforts to deal with the problems. But the carriers are a different story. That's just a huge chunk of pork. Pilots just said, "Yeah, we'll give you money for that." And if you come back and ask for more money for testing and say, "Well, do you really need that?" That doesn't give us a lot more jobs. That's just a bunch of boffins, playing with a small a bit of technology and turning up a lot of money, which isn't creating a lot of jobs to get me reelected. So you have that dynamic, working at it as well. And the Navy basically has an opportunity here to do some fundamental changes. I mean, they have to learn the surface warfare and the carrier aviation admirals have to basically learn how to talk back to the politicians. I mean, the submarine guys, they can still, 50 years later, invoke the loss of the Thresher and the Scorpion and get respect. Plus, our submarine force has always been the premier force in terms of quality and capability in the Navy. I mean, the carriers do a lot of work, and all the other surface warships contribute. But the nuclear submarines are, alone, as it were, and they do have a much better track record. But it's gotten so bad with the carriers now that, especially the carriers, I mean, there's only 10 of them, and they're aging out really quickly. And the Navy has really not come up with a good solution. The emails is still, the fix is still a work in progress. And the other quality control issues, they say, well, we're going to do something about it. I don't know. It's not like you can take some submarine officers over and put them in charge, because it's really a different culture and it cannot be easily changed. So that's really a question of senior leadership in the Navy and in Congress, basically facing up to the fact that there needs to be some fundamental changes in how these ships are designed and how they are tested and how they are built. One that's very similar to what's going on in the submarine field. But as we see with the submarine, in this, the submarine segment, is they're building a lot of these boats, but again, there's limitations on the shipyard workers, and this quality control problem with the skilled workers is showing up in the surface warship area as well. But of course, they can paper that over. I mean, that's basically what happened with the mistakes in the Ford. The designers and the people involved in testing and proofing this stuff before you start installing it were simply incompetent. I mean, they basically blew it. And there's been no evidence yet that has really changed. I mean, they're talking about a new frigate design. If they adopt a successful European design, that's probably a good sign, because it means, hey, all right, I know not invented here is a sacred precept we must always follow, but slowly the United States has, over the past few decades, realized that we're not the only ones who can design effective weapons, and we've been basically buying more and more foreign stuff simply because it's better than anything we could do. And if we try and outdo what the foreign designs do, we tend to screw it up. If it ain't broke, why fix it? If it ain't broke, don't try and fix it. And that's a hard habit to break. But that's what basically has to happen. So at the moment, we're trying to play catch up, not just with the Chinese, but with the aging out of our existing warships. These warships have a finite life. You can basically patch some of them up and keep them going for a little while longer, but they take a heck of a beating at sea. One reason we have an effective Navy is we keep our ships at sea a lot. And that is a lesson that was learned over hundreds of years, that having a lot of ships is one thing, but having crews that are skilled in basically operating them in the high seas in all sorts of nasty weather, and actually operating the weapon systems and what have you, especially on carriers, that's something that basically burns out the ships. And once they reach a certain point, they have to retire, because otherwise they're a hazard. They don't work so well. They're a hazard to the crews, and they really don't do their job. So the clock is ticking, and right now it's not ticking in our favor. And at the same time, the Chinese basically are not really being held back by any existing technology. They're building everything anew, and the Navy is the how should I put it, much admired by the Chinese public. They get a big kick out of their first carrier, all these new warships. The Chinese are now building the Type 55 destroyers, which are basically clones of the Burke, in some ways improved. Now, the Chinese have a problem that they only like to discuss internally, but it leaks out, in that they're military in general has a long history of corruption, which still exists. And that corruption includes generals and admirals papering over inefficiency, ineffectiveness. And of course, the Chinese haven't really been at war for a long, long time. And the Navy is trying to overcome that by not just building these new ships, but as our Navy has noted, they're out there a lot. So their crews are finally getting that kind of experience you can only get by having the ships at sea a lot and using their weapons or using their equipment in general. And our Navy is constantly encountering these more competent, Chinese ships and their more competent, more experienced crews. And they're telling, Congress, look, these guys are becoming a serious threat. And if it comes to a war, you can't take for granted that it's going to be, victory at sea, World War II style all over again. They are more of a threat than the Russians are. And there's plenty of concrete evidence for that. It's not just, the usual scare stories the military uses to get more money out of Congress.
Now, the Navy's doing a little bit better with their replacing their aging F-18s, right, with the new F-35 B and Cs.
Yes. The F-35 was a come-to-Jesus moment, so to speak. That's where people realized that Mr. Augustine was right, and there has to be a change made. Part of the problem was with Congress, where they like to basically do short orders, as it were. They don't like to allocate money for multi-year contracts. Now, the multi-year contract is a lot more efficient. And with our new current government, they've got more people in there who are basically more pragmatic about having an efficient procurement program rather than just placating all the politicians. And this means that they have literally gotten the price of the F-35 down. Now, the F-35 still has a lot of problems. It has revolutionary technology. Pilots who are using it are praising it. They said it's a marvelous advance over previous types of warplanes, and they're demonstrating that by their governments turning around and ordering more F-35s. And so that's going gangbusters, but there are still problems. Because they're stealth aircraft, they're more expensive and more time-consuming to maintain. Like any new aircraft, there's a lot of new technology in there. It's basically an aircraft that you basically don't just start; you boot it up literally. The pilot enters his name and his password, and off she goes. But once they're up and running, they're a marvelous bit of technology. But the problem is, it's no good if you have a marvelous bit of technology, but you only have a handful of them. Now, the Navy's planning on building, up to 3,000 or more F-35s, if and when, and they probably will, get the kinks worn out, because there are new incentive programs for the manufacturer to basically reward them for coming in on time. And up to quality control and basically fixing their flaws that they basically ignored, as it were, when they passed it on to the aviation folks, and that so far seems to be working. That is a major step forward, one that should have been implemented long ago. But the Air Forces, the Navy and the Air Force itself, and of course the Army, which has a lot more aircraft than the Navy, mostly in terms of helicopters. They learned the hard way because we use them a lot, and we find out what the flaws are real quick. Of course, that creates another problem in that because of the war on terror, as it were, that was quite intense for about a decade, and it's still fairly hard on the aircraft. It wore out a lot of aircraft earlier than they normally would have because they simply were used more. And that's great for creating skilled pilots, but basically you can replace the pilots more easily than you can the worn out aircraft. So yeah, the F-35 and of course the F-18, the later model, the Super Hornet, as it were, the F-32, F-18F, E and F. they're performing well, but the Navy is still dragging its feet on the use of UAVs on the carrier. Now, we've reported that for a decade now. The Navy did make huge progress in developing carrier-borne UAVs. We've successfully shown that the UAV can take off and land on its own, as it were. A lot of that technology has been moved over. Well, first it went from existing technology in manned aircraft, which made landing on carriers safer and easier, as it were. But now the requirement to make it even more effective for fully autonomous landing, every time, has also been transferred to the manned aviation. So that saves lives, it saves times, it saves aircraft, etc. But the Navy has been hesitant to go full bore, as it were, in replacing a lot of their manned carrier-borne aircraft with unmanned carrier-borne aircraft. There's another problem, which, again, we're working on another piece for a strategy page on this, about the software, the network software a lot of these aircraft use. The Chinese, I assume it's the Chinese, are making enormous efforts to hack our aviation and naval systems, for the ships as well as for the aircraft. That is a serious vulnerability, and that remains to be seen. Now, of course, that works both ways. We have demonstrated in the past, and we don't talk about it much, that we're able to hack enemy military networks. The Israelis are very good at this. Again, the Israelis are a tremendous resource for us because the Israelis are always under attack. And of course, they have Syria as a testing zone, as it were, where they've been using the F-35, which they've modified. It's the F-35I, and they basically twisted our arm to allow them more access to the F-35 software than we allowed anybody else. Of course, that is because you can trust the Israelis because they are at war. They're constantly at war, and their security is pretty good. Actually, it's probably better than ours in terms of protecting military secrets. So we are dependent on the Israelis for helping us out with a lot of this hacker-proofing of aircraft. But everybody will be vulnerable to that because even the Chinese in their most modern jet fighters, they still have a lot of older stuff, but they are converting rapidly. They will be vulnerable as well, so that cuts both ways. But in the meantime, we have problems with just supervising the design and construction of these new systems, a problem that is unique to the United States because we're the leader in these areas. Chinese will run across it eventually. They have run across it in trying to build effective SSNs and SSBNs, something they have not been able to do yet. That ticks them off big time. But again, it's a matter of experience. And basically build something you can't really steal. I mean, just the skilled workers are something you develop locally. It's not something you can export. You basically have to get people, screen people, get people who have the potential, get them into the jobs, get them through their apprenticeship, can last a year or more. And then manage them. We've had problems with management in the military procurement area. That's another sore point, which a lot of the defense manufacturing firms don't really take as seriously as it should. And it's up to the military to basically put them under the spotlight, to basically demonstrate particular areas, particular instances. Again, the submarine community has always been much more quick to do that. They will criticize. They will name names, and the surface Navy really has to adopt a lot of those practices because it's the only way they're going to get out in this high tech world. You could get away with being a little sloppy, during World War II, where you didn't have all the technology problems. A ship was a ship, and a lot of these ships during World War II weren't expected to last much long after World War II, and a lot of them didn't. A lot of them were retired. And we figured, the war was over, but then the Cold War started, and we said, whoops, back again. But we had that enormous reservoir of skilled managers and workers to draw upon, and we kept that pool of management and labor expertise going. But now we're running into a real problem with the after the Cold War, where we've had this dearth, a lot of reduced production, fewer workers, and now a lot of them are retiring. That's something that happens, but now it's happened. It's doubly bad right now in the shipbuilding industry in general, particularly in the submarine building area. The Navy has to basically deal with multiple problems at once if they want to continue to maintain their qualitative edge in naval warfare. And that's it. I mean, a lot of the decisive battles in future wars are fought during peacetime, and this is a classic example of that.
Well, we'll have to keep our eye on the Navy and see what happens over the next little while. I'm sure we'll be reporting on it more. Thanks,
Indeed,
Jim.
we will. Bye-bye.
Bye.